All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining today. It is 6 o'clock on the dot, so we're going to get started with the webinar. My name is Jamila Pickett. I'm the Senior Coordinator of Education at the Epilepsy Foundation of Minnesota, and I am going to be facilitating your Seizure Smart Basics training. So we can get started. All right, so before we get into the actual content, there's a few housekeeping items that I do want to go over. So this is going to be a 30-minute basic training. So we're just going to be going over the basic overviews of seizure recognition and response, two of the most common seizures that you may see in real life. As far as bandwidth goes, if you are watching this from a computer, it is recommended that you have things like Spotify or YouTube off, because it can affect the way that the webinar runs, and it can affect how slowly or fast that the webinar runs as well. We do have some video clips in this webinar, so we would just want to make sure that that runs smoothly. Unfortunately, since this is a 30-minute webinar, you do not get a certificate of completion for this one, but please feel free to reach out if you would like to learn about other methods that you can get that certificate. We do have other ways that you can get the certificate of completion, excuse me. And my contact information will be at the end of this presentation. And this is also being recorded as well. I will be taking all questions at the end of this webinar because it's just going to help with the flow. So we can get started with the content. All right, so today's objectives, we're going to learn basic epilepsy facts and figures, and we're also going to want to recognize the basic differences between seizure types and learn appropriate seizure recognition and response. All right, so some facts about epilepsy. It is not a contagious condition, so you can't catch it like a flu or a cold, nor can you catch seizures like a flu or a cold. Epilepsy is not a mental illness, though there are many people with epilepsy that do have some sort of mental illness or some sort of condition that falls along these lines. So it is definitely a comorbidity that is common and perfectly normal. Epilepsy exists on a spectrum. So when I think about this factor, I'm really thinking about the person's seizure type and then where they are on their epilepsy diagnosis journey. So maybe they're at the beginning of their journey where they're still trying to go through some medication trials, they're still maybe figuring out their seizure type, things like that. Then this person may be having many seizures in a day. On the other hand, maybe somebody has been diagnosed for years, they really have their seizures well managed, then they may have little or no seizures, maybe they haven't had seizures in years. A person's seizure type can affect intensity as well. And then the last fact about epilepsy is that people rarely die from having a seizure, and most seizures are not life-threatening. So definitely you knowing how to respond to the seizure can be something that can be life-saving for an individual. So what epilepsy is a neurological condition that causes reoccurring seizures. The key for it to be epilepsy is it does have to stem from a person's brain, and then it does have to happen more than once in a person's lifetime. Another key factor when we're thinking about epilepsy is it has to do with the electricity in a person's brain. So this image that you see on your screen now is really just to show that electricity, and that travels throughout the brain and tells us what to do. And I'll go through this a little bit more in the next slide or two. Sometimes epilepsy may be called seizure condition or disorder, depending on who you're talking to. I would always take this with a grain of salt because these terms actually can work as umbrella terms for a lot of other conditions to fall under. So there are a lot of other seizure conditions, and epilepsy is one of them. Though it's not wrong for someone to call it a seizure condition or a seizure disorder, I would just use whatever term they feel most comfortable with. All right, and then this image gives us an idea of how prevalent epilepsy is throughout the United States and across the globe. About 1 in 26 people will develop epilepsy at some point in their lifetime. There's not really a common denominator there. So you can develop it at any age. It can happen in any location that you're living in and amongst gender as well. 1 in 10 people will have a seizure at some point in their life, and you do not have to have epilepsy to fall into this statistic. So 1 in 10 of us will have a seizure. Maybe 1 in 10 of us have already had this seizure, but really just keeping this in mind because anybody can have a seizure around you at any time. So knowing how to respond for those with epilepsy and anyone else is important. And then the last statistic that I like to go over is more for you to kind of have an idea in your mind about how prevalent epilepsy is. And that's about one child in every other classroom having epilepsy. So sometimes it may seem like it's less than this, but especially when we're thinking about children, a lot of individuals may not get diagnosed in their childhood. And that can be a reason why it seems like this number is smaller. Maybe people are not disclosing that they have epilepsy, but this is how common it is. All right, so of course, when we're talking about epilepsy and we're talking about seizures, we do want to go in depth about what a seizure is. That is the symptom of epilepsy. So on your screen, you do see different parts of the brain kind of lighting up. This is just to signify that they are in charge of different functions in our body. Throughout these different parts, we have what is called pathways, and on these pathways are the electrical signals that I talked about before. These are called neurons. Now, throughout the day, they travel through our brain and throughout these different parts, kind of working together to tell us what to do. When we're eating, we're sitting, we're watching TV, etc. But what can happen when somebody is having a seizure associated with epilepsy is these neurons can get sent when they're not supposed to. That is called a misfiring, and that's what can change a person's awareness, sensation, movement, and that is the seizure being visualized in that person. Depending on what part of the brain that misfiring is affecting, that's what the seizure is going to look like. So, for example, let's say the occipital lobe is being affected by that misfiring. The occipital lobe is in charge of things like eyesight and pretty much vision. So this person may be seeing things that are not actually there. On the other hand, maybe the entire brain is being affected by misfiring activity. If that's the case, then maybe this person is having entire body convulsions. This image just gives us an idea of different epilepsy causations. So it would be impossible to put on a list everything that can cause epilepsy, but a good rule of thumb is anything that can damage or harm a person's brain can cause epilepsy. Unfortunately, 70% of epilepsy cases have an unknown cause, but of the known causes, head trauma or brain injury is the #1 known cause. And as you can see, many of these examples do kind of fall in line with that, but there are some examples such as genetic basis that differ a bit. All right, so now we're going to go over seizure triggers. A seizure trigger is something that can happen in a person's environment that can cause them to have that misfiring activity in their brain, which obviously causes them to exhibit that seizure. So not every person with epilepsy has a seizure trigger, and just because you have a seizure trigger does not mean you have more than one. And you also want to keep in mind that a seizure doesn't always have a trigger associated with it. So that's just important to keep in mind so we don't make false associations. I've heard in one video this man saying that every time he would see his mother-in-law that this person would have a seizure, and they're thinking, oh, then my mother-in-law is my trigger. But of course, maybe this person's trigger was something else and they associated it with something completely different than that, or maybe they just randomly had a seizure, which is also very common. So there are 3 seizure triggers that I like to go over in a little bit more depth. It's the last one, photosensitivity, then we have stress and anxiety, and then lack of sleep and fatigue. So first I'm going to go over the photosensitivity one just because it is a pretty notorious trigger. People are aware of this trigger. Perhaps they've seen warnings for it before they've gone to certain locations. Maybe we've seen warnings for it before we've seen a movie or something like that. It's usually thought of as flashing lights or strobe lights, but it doesn't just have to be that type of light. So it is a rare trigger, so it is not something that every person with epilepsy would be triggered by. But for a person that does have this trigger, it could also be regular fluorescent lights or light from the sun as well. So it is important to keep that in mind, that it's not a common trigger, but it may be something that's not just that stereotype of flashing lights or strobe lights. Then we have stress and anxiety. This one is actually the largest trigger outside of missed or late medication, but it's not as easily identifiable because there's a lot of things that can tell us that there are flashing lights or strobe lights or things like that in the next room we can warn somebody about. But you might not be able to warn somebody about the stress that they have ahead of them. I always advocate for times in the day to try to de-stress if you have this trigger, maybe spaces to de-stress. We do want to minimize those big triggers, or those big stressors, but we also want to think about the small stressors throughout the day that can be triggers as well. And then lastly, I like to talk about lack of sleep and fatigue. Now, fatigue can definitely be a trigger for some people, but also for some individuals, that sleep piece altogether can be a trigger. So perhaps around the time that a person usually wakes up or around the time that they usually go to sleep, they have increased seizure activity. And maybe for the rest of the day, they have little or no seizure activity. That's not true of everyone, but that's why things like sleep time are also important to think about when you're thinking about all around wellness in epilepsy and seizures. All right, so now we're going to be moving into seizure type and classification. So as of right now, we do know that there are many different seizure types. So one person's seizure type might look completely different than another person's seizure type. About 10 years ago, we used to think there were 20 seizure types. We're constantly breaking down categories and building them up. So as of right now, there are actually 40 plus known seizure types. And so, as I said, a person's seizure type can really tell you what it looks like and what part of the brain is being affected by misfiring. Then we have our seizure classifications, and those actually break down those seizure types. So a seizure type would be broken down into either focal or generalized seizures. And then we have the unknown onset. So with that unknown onset piece, the key here for each one is the word onset, and it's talking about where in the brain that misfiring is coming from. So if somebody is having an unknown onset seizure, it doesn't mean that they're not having focal or generalized seizures. What might be happening is that they have a preliminary diagnosis of epilepsy, but they just don't know where that misfiring is stemming from at that time. But later on, they might find that out. Then we have focal seizures. If you're familiar with seizure types and classifications, then you may have known this one as partial seizures. So the reason we moved away from that terminology is really because it's not accurate, which I'll talk a little bit more about, and I think the next slide here. With a focal seizure, we're thinking about a focused area of the brain being affected. So this person can have awareness during their seizure. Maybe their seizure looks something like movement of their arm. Maybe it's a sensory seizure, smelling things that are not there, seeing things that are not there. But if they're having a focal aware seizure, then they know what's going on around them and they are fully aware. On the other hand, a person can have impaired awareness during their seizure. And they may look like they're fully aware, and in reality, they don't know what's going on around them, and they may not be able to respond to what's going on around them. Then we have the generalized onset seizures. This one's a little bit easier to remember because it does affect the entire brain. So this person will always have some sort of impaired awareness. All right, so as I touched on in the previous slide, focal onset seizures used to be called partial seizures. And really what that language used to mean was an entire hemisphere of the person's brain is being affected by misfiring activity. But that's not descriptive, because an entire hemisphere is not being affected. Just a focused or a isolated area is being affected by that misfiring activity. Some common ones are the focal aware and then the focal impaired awareness seizure. The focal aware seizure typically doesn't have a response, and this is the one where people might say that they smell something that's funny, or they might see things that are not actually there. So you would just respond when appropriately, and this would be indicated in their seizure action plan. Again, this one typically does not have a response. Then we have the focal impaired awareness seizure. This one is when a person can be confused and they may not know what's going on around them. This is the most common seizure type amongst adults and children combined. It's purposeless, repetitive movements, which again, I'll talk about when we get to response. I believe the next slide here is a clip of a child having this type of seizure.
The complex partial seizure usually starts with a blank stare. The child may experience a loss of awareness and will exhibit automatic behavior known as autonomisms, such as a chewing motion or picking at their clothing. The preschooler having a complex partial seizure may seem dazed and may mumble. Sometimes the child's behavior may be mistaken for disorderly conduct.
All right, so a few things I want to point out is, one, they did use old terminology. Again, they moved away from the term partial because it's just not descriptive. But another thing I do want to point out was this child was standing. He looked like he was looking around a little bit, and at even some points, he was watching what the woman was doing with her mouth. So it almost seemed like he was trying to pay attention to what the woman was saying. Now, in reality, a person is at a basic level of functioning when they're having this type of seizure. So they have fight and flight kind of going on in the back of their head. So a person can have their attention directed towards something because of the tone of voice, or because it's a loud noise, or things like that. So it's not because he understood necessarily what she was saying, but maybe the way she was speaking redirected his attention. So I'm gonna play this one more time just so we can look at what the woman and the child is doing. Another thing that I wanna mention is she's kind of holding him in one place to keep him standing up, I think. We never direct people to restrain or hold a person in one place when they're having a seizure. That can be dangerous. This is an older video, but I just wanted to put that out there. So I will play it one more time just so we can watch again what his focal seizures look like.
The complex partial seizure usually starts with a blank stare. The child may experience a loss of awareness and will exhibit automatic behavior known as autonomisms, such as a chewing motion or picking at their clothing. The preschooler having a complex partial seizure may seem dazed and may mumble. Sometimes the child's behavior may be mistaken for disorderly conduct.
All right. So the focal impaired awareness seizure can look different from person to person, but each person typically does the same thing every time. It's going to usually be purposeless, repetitive movements, but for some people it can just be things like staring off. In the example we just saw, the child was picking at his shirt. He kind of had chewing motions. Some individuals, their seizure might look like walking from back and forth from point A to point B, or maybe they're just sitting there and picking at their shirt or something like that. So it can look very different, but that person will show it the same way each time typically. So the way you would respond is really at 3 levels. The first level is maybe the person is just sitting there and they're not hurting themselves or others. Then you would just want to let them have their seizure and just make sure that they're okay. If they have a seizure action plan, you want to make yourself aware of that and follow whatever it says in there, because what that says is going to aid you in knowing exactly what to do for that particular child. And then when we're moving to the next step, this individual would be somebody who is maybe walking around or maybe getting into things a little bit more. They could hurt themselves. Then you would want to move things out of the way so that they could freely have their seizures, maybe block off any hazards in their way. And then the last response would be what you see on the screen here. So maybe you can't move those hazards away and you just want to make sure that they're safe. There are too many hazards for them. It always depends on the individual and their situation, so be sure to follow their seizure action plan. Stay calm. That can help you remember the steps of responding to the seizure. Track the time. 1 to 3 minutes is typical of the seizure. 5 minutes is when you want to call 911 unless their seizure action plan says otherwise. Never restrain or hold a person in one place when they're having this type of seizure, but what you can do is either block out their path or come up behind them, gently place your hands on their shoulders, and gently guide them away from whatever hazards they may be walking towards. As humans, we take the path of least resistance, but as I said before, they are in fight or flight mode. So if you come head on, use aggressive tones, aggressive touches, then their brain might say, hey, this person is acting aggressively towards you, they're trying to hurt you, even though that might not be the case, and they could have an aggressive response. So make sure that you are using soft tones and soft touches. And then you just stay with this person until they are fully aware. Proper documentation is always important, and make sure that they are okay. It is common for people to have a headache after this seizure. All right, now we're going to move into generalized seizures. So we have some common subcategorized types that we see here, but we're really going to be going over that tonic-clonic one today, and that's a pretty common one. When we're thinking about generalized seizures, always remember that both sides of the brain are being affected, so the entire brain is being affected, and this person will always have impaired awareness. All right, so the generalized tonic-clonic seizure used to be known as grand mal. We're moving away from old terminology because it's not descriptive, and some of them are not respectful. So in French, the term grand mal literally translates into big bad. You don't want that word in the name of your medical condition. So obvious reasons why they moved away from that. It's not the most common seizure type, but for a person who has a seizure that may not have epilepsy, their seizure could look similar to this one, and you respond the same way. This person does lose complete consciousness, and this can lead to loss of certain controls, such as bladder or bowel. Some people do vomit during the seizure. There's typically a progression, so first you may hear air or some sort of yelping coming from this person's mouth. That's because not only are we convulsing externally, but we're also convulsing internally. So we're pushing air out right before that seizure starts, and that's where the noise is coming from. Then we move into the tonic phase where we stiffen, and then the clonic phase when we have those convulsions. Not everyone has a tonic phase, and not everyone has a clonic phase. This typically lasts 1 to 3 minutes, but again, 5 minutes is when you want to be calling 911 unless their seizure action plan says otherwise. All right, the next clip here is a child having a tonic-clonic seizure. It is not an emergency seizure by any means. It's about a 50-second video. I definitely recommend anyone who can watch it to watch it because it's important to see what a seizure looks like so you know what it looks like in real life as well. So I'm going to go to the next slide here.
They affect the whole brain and the entire body. The tonic phase is the stiffening of the muscles. Then the jerking movements begin, the clonic activity that you see here. A tonic-clonic seizure rarely lasts more than a few minutes. A person having one isn't conscious and won't remember what happened. The skin may become pale. Breathing may seem shallow or labored. Sometimes a child may lose bladder or bowel control or vomit as the seizure ends. These seizures may look painful or even life-threatening.
So as that clip was ending there, it was saying they may look painful, they may look life-threatening, but in reality, typically they are not life-threatening. We do not know if people feel pain during this type of seizure, but if they do, they won't remember it. All right, so the way you would respond to a tonic-clonic seizure, the numbers correspond with the image on the screen, but this doesn't necessarily have a specific order because as you can see, it says to number 4 time the seizure, but you would want to be doing this from the beginning till the end. Maybe you're working with somebody else to respond to the seizure, then some of this stuff might be happening at the same time. So the first thing on the image is to turn the person onto their side. This allows for any saliva or any other secretions to freely flow from their mouth so that they have a cleared airway and they can breathe. The second thing on the image is to cushion their head. So grabbing a backpack, a pillow. You can also use your lap as a soft spot for their head to go, or cup your hands underneath their head to let their head freely bounce off the palm of your hands. We want to protect the head because that's where the seizures are coming from in the brain, and we don't want to cause further damage. The third thing is to remove anything that might get in the way of you responding to the seizure. In this example, it's glasses. The fourth thing, as I said before, you're going to be doing this from the beginning, but you're going to time the seizure from the beginning till the end. The recovery period is not included in the timing of the seizure. And then you want to stay with the person until they are fully aware. So for this type of seizure, it is common for a person to have a headache afterwards, for them to need to take a deep rest. So do allow them to do that. It is a very tiring seizure, and you do want to make sure you're comparing what's happening to their seizure action plan, if they have one, just to make sure that everything is safe and normal for them. Time to call 911 is if it's a first-time seizure, if it's the first time of you knowing of this person having a seizure, if an injury takes place beyond what you can attend to, if they stop breathing before, after, or during the seizure, if the seizure is longer than 5 minutes, if it takes place in water, even if they seem fine, you do need to call 911 because we can go our entire day with water in our lungs and feel fine. Going to sleep with water in your lungs is dangerous. If there's another health condition such as diabetes or pregnancy, and of course if you just feel like you can't respond appropriately. All right, so we are coming up to the end of this presentation. Again, as I said earlier on, if you do have any questions, please put that in the question and answer area. I'm going to go through these last few slides here, and then I'll take a look to see if we got any. These are some resources that you can definitely utilize. If you do want a copy of this PowerPoint, please feel free to reach out to me. This is my contact information, as well as our link to an evaluation that you will get in a follow-up email. All of our educational trainings are free, so if you do want to consider donating, please do so from that link. And then we do have some other links that I recommend, which you can get in this PowerPoint if you would like it here. So it looks like we do have a question. All right, so I got a question that says, can you say more about a seizure action plan? What is it? Does everyone with seizures need one? Who would it be shared with? So a seizure action plan is a document that really needs to be created with the guidance of your physician, though I have seen people take information from their seizure action plan and put it in a simpler template for people to kind of read, so it is easier to follow. It's going to have information about this individual, what their seizures look like, how you would respond to their specific seizures, how long they are, medication, side effects, etc. And most children have a seizure action plan because they're in school. Some adults do not have one. Typically, this is shared with schools, but you can also share this with your employer as well. All right. And then I got another question. How do we access the recording? I would love to watch it again, or I would like to watch it again. So please feel free to reach out to me. I will also be sending a follow-up email as well. So if you do want to respond to that follow-up, or if you want to reach out by my email or call the number, I can get that recording to you. All right, well, it is 6:30, so if you do have any questions, please feel free to send that directly to me. If I haven't gotten to your question, I can email you or call you directly as well. But I do want to be respectful of everyone's time. So thank you so much for joining us, and I do hope that you learned something tonight.